Hello everybody! Bismarck hit a tree while doing a ground attack mission, so this week he won't show up. So Justin and me, Military History Visualized, will jump in to give you your weekly dose of military aviation history. And we will talk a bit about the debate prior to World War II about the role of the aircraft carrier and the battleship.
This is a subject that it comes up relatively often, but it's often oversimplified as these stuffy battleship admirals against these brilliant visionaries, when the reality is a lot more complicated and nuanced. So, for example, Mark Peattie, noted historian of air power in this period, on the Japanese side anyway, he notes that, for example, in the 1920s, aircraft were very limited in their capability. So, for example, they were small, they were fragile, they were capable of flying only over short range, they had no adequate means of communication with ships or shore bases, they only had the crudest of navigation systems, and they were incapable of delivering their bombs with any accuracy. Also, dive bombing, as an aside, hadn't even been invented yet. And they were subject to any kind of grounding in bad weather, so there is basically very little evidence to indicate that naval aircraft were going to be any kind of serious threat to surface ships.
So basically they were in a state like, you could say, the early tanks, so that you can see you can use them as a support but not as a main weapon?
Yeah, exactly. It was in a very, very early stage. Of course, there had been the usage of naval or aircraft in naval warfare in the First World War, but of course it was very limited. And really there hadn't been a whole lot of progression into the 1920s. For example, everyone will point to Billy Mitchell, his experiments. The Japanese, if I remember correctly, also did a very similar kind of experiment. I'm not sure if the British ever did, but where he ended up spending hours sinking a static, obsolete, unmanned battleship with no air defense, no damage control, and eventually it sank. And the Navy's response was basically, so what? Really demonstrated nothing. In fact, it actually reinforced the point held within the Navy that aircraft had not matured yet, because with everything going their way in like a sterile laboratory environment it is not at all realistic, it still took them like an embarrassingly long period of time to actually sink it. So it really didn't prove anything. And on that account, the aircraft capabilities really didn't even improve that much from 1920 all the way to 1937 either. It really wasn't until the late 1930s that there was an exponential increase in the capabilities of naval aircraft. And then that was mixed with the maturing of torpedo and eventually the invention and maturing of dive bombing, which started to actually pose a serious threat. But already, by the time we get up to that point, we are like right on the eve of the start of the Second World War.
And what I find interesting for is, I think the aircraft carriers were started rather early to be built. They were built already in the 1920s. So in a way, the Navy at least wasn't completely ignorant, right?
Yes, that's a very important point to make. Is did you read my notes? Because I was really going to go into that point.
Anyway. No, but I just remembered that the early aircraft carriers were built in the 1920s or something, and you know, I grab everything I know, and it's very little, but I can grab to that usually.
But yeah, that's a very important point, is that the debate is often characterized as people that are anti-aircraft or they're completely ignoring air power, where there's really no examples of that at all. It's more an arguing over degrees and the role they would play. So everybody understood very early on, all the way back to the Washington Naval Treaty and back into even the First World War, that like, hey, aircraft actually have a future in the fleet. So nobody was really arguing that we could just do away with aircraft or ignore them. It's just it was a debate over whether aircraft carriers could be kind of form the center of the fleet, the offensive core, which in the 1920s was clearly not possible, or even into the 1930s. However, very certain features of naval aircraft were recognized very early on. Reconnaissance, spotting for the big guns of the battleships. And then as aircraft began to mature, it transitioned into winning air superiority over the site of the decisive battle between the fleets, in order to deny reconnaissance and spotting to the enemy.
So it basically developed exactly like air power developed in the First World War. First, they were just doing recon, and then they needed to shoot down recon and gain air superiority, and then they started bombing.
Yeah, pretty much the exact same progression, because eventually they came to the conclusion that the best way to win air control over the decisive engagement was to sink the enemy's aircraft carriers. And during the 1920s, some discussion began to pop up that, hey, naval aircraft could at least slow or damage capital ships so that the surface fleet could finish them off. So we're starting to see in the early 1930s the development of this idea that maybe we can use naval air power a little bit more offensively. Now, one little tidbit, I won't get into too much detail, but if you ever wondered why everybody's anti-aircraft suites were so crap at the start of the war and everybody greatly increased their power, it's because there was a general conception that they overestimated the value of anti-aircraft defenses on warships. Just as a random little aside. Anyway, years ago,
I mean, it was the same, I think, for ground forces, because they later on also really increased. So basically, everyone overestimated anti-aircraft guns. Wait, there was something in the Spanish Civil War lessons. Yeah, they noted that most low-level or the smaller guns were not sufficient, and the 88, for instance, was rather important. So actually, to a certain degree, they at least should have learned that from the Spanish Civil War. But we know that very little was learned there from many sides.
Yeah, when the war broke out, they were starting to transition. For example, people were slowly figuring out that any kind, like heavy machine guns, which pretty much everybody had on their warships, they were insufficient. They needed something like in the 20 millimeter range, for example. I read years ago a 1936 report by the British Committee of Imperial Defense, where it was discussing the vulnerability of capital ships to air attack. Actually, it was very interesting. And they justified their reluctance to stop building battleships. This is 1936 again, and they said, we're not going to do away with battleships, and here's some of their justifications. So, quote, yet no other great naval power, though with less risk that we ourselves should run, proposes to do away with capital ships. Should we be the first to do so? Surely not, unless the question is settled beyond all possible doubt. We do not find that question is so settled. It may never be settled without the test of war, but the information at present at our disposal leads us to believe that the day of the capital ship is not over, now or in the near future. To assume that it is and to cease to build them would lead to grave risk of disaster. It's more rational than people often portray.
Yeah, and especially we should consider that naval strategy is build strategy, and building capital ships and everything takes years, and also maintaining them. I mean, the Hood was still built, I think, in World War One.
Yeah, late teens into the 20s, if I remember.
Yeah, so this is the thing which some people forget. It's not like tanks, and even tanks were not scrapped. I mean, there were World War One tanks in World War Two and everything. So you don't scrap everything and then say, oh, okay, we just build aircraft carriers. It's not like a computer game where it's just, okay, upgrades. It's we are talking
Hearts of Iron
years, or decades. This is something people also seem to forget.
But another interesting thing to note is that even into the Second World War, when you look at the role of that naval air power played, some of the wildest claims made by air power advocates never actually occurred. They had overstated the value of air power back in the 20s and 30s, even to the extent that after it had matured into the 1940s, it still fell short of their expectations. So, for example, aircraft never replaced the surface fleet, and capital ships could defend themselves far more effectively than some of the more radical air power advocates had assumed. For example, the limited success of massed land-based air power against warships in all theaters demonstrated this. Now, that's not to say it was ineffective. It was land-based air power was still a serious threat, and nowhere near the sea-clearing harbingers of doom that some of the most radical air power advocates had claimed in the interwar years. But it really, in conclusion, the argument was less, again, stuffy battleship admirals versus brilliant visionaries, and was more a debate about how much of a role air power would play. And at the end of the day, until World War II really got going, air power advocates had theories and wild claims, whereas the more cautious moderates within the navies had facts. So you can't look at this view in hindsight, which you often see, particularly they'll single out one example of somebody building battleships and then go, oh, they built battleships in 1936. Well, it's like, well, yeah, because they didn't know. They didn't have all our books and everything that we could go and figure out exactly what was going to happen. So you have to be very careful of hindsight. In the words of that British Committee of Imperial Defense meeting, once again, their logic, it pretty much concluded like this: if the air power theories turn out well-founded, we have wasted money in building new capital ships. If ill-founded, we would, in putting them to the test, have lost the empire.
Yeah, I think that settles the point. So thank you for joining us, Justin.
Yeah, no problem.
And thank you for watching. See you next time.